Hey guys, welcome back to another episode of the Day in the Life podcast, Career Insights brought to you by ConsultSpot. I think I'm finally starting to get the hang of this, trying to crank out as many of these as possible. We got a fun one for you. It's another one of my former colleagues. His name's Irvin Gomez. Irvin has had an interesting journey starting off at Chicago, where he moved to after living in Mexico for 10 years. Went to Dartmouth and then went into banking, sales for a little bit after that, and then got into Harvard Business School, where he was actually the president of the student body government. And from there, went on to work at BCG as an intern and is now working on his own search fund, which is within private equity. So I think this one's a bit longer than our usual ones because I think there was a lot of interesting material to cover. Uh, so I hope you find value in at least one of the parts that we dive deep into. And as usual, keep the feedback coming. I would love to hear from you guys, especially if you're one of those who are not my friends that are still listening. I don't know how you found out about the podcast, so I'd love to hear how you heard about it, what you think about it so far. Uh, and yeah, always welcome some feedback. Without further ado, let's jump right in. Hey, Irvin, thanks so much for joining us.
Hey, Rich, how's it going?
Doing pretty good. So, Irvin, just to kick us off, do you mind giving us some context into kind of what you're doing right now?
Absolutely. So currently, I'm the managing partner and founder of Due North Family Enterprises, which is a search fund that is looking to acquire one great business in the Midwest. And so the goal is for me to find a business, acquire it, and then run it as CEO for the long term.
Got it. That sounds super interesting, and we'll dive into that in a second. Could you give us some background into kind of, where you're from, where you went to school, and how you got into this position?
I was born in Mexico, so I lived in Mexico for 10 years before my family moved to Waukegan, Illinois, so 45 minutes north of Chicago. I went to high school there and then ended up going to Dartmouth for my undergrad, majored in government and economics. And after Dartmouth, I spent a year and a half at State Street in their internal consulting team before making a transition to what at that point was called Hourly Nerd
Hmm.
to join their sales team. Hourly Nerd eventually became Catalant, and I was at Catalant as a sales rep and an account executive for about 5 years before applying to get an MBA and going to HBS. And so I graduated from HBS back in May. And shortly after graduating, I started doing North Family Enterprises, and it's been a lot of fun since.
Got it. There's a lot to unpack there. Let's take it one at a time. What was your high school experience like, and how'd you prepare for getting into Dartmouth? And looking back, what do you think were some of the most important parts that kind of helped you get in and also do well while you were there?
That's a really complicated question to answer, and there's a couple of reasons why. When I got to the US, my family didn't know that we were going to be in a really tough school district.
Hmm.
And so we landed in one of the worst performing school districts in Illinois, one where there really wasn't a college going culture.
Hmm.
Thankfully for my brother and I, there was a scholarship program and a college guidance program that just so happened to be in our high school. And that gave us the ability to navigate the college process. The way that I see it, or the way that I frame it, is that that program helped us see what was possible. We were
Hmm.
good students, but we didn't really know what was possible. And so they gave us the confidence and, more importantly, the tools and the guidance to go and apply to the Ivy League or go apply to the best schools in the US. And that's how it happened. Frankly, the way that I picked Dartmouth was based on the financial aid that they provided.
Hmm.
They said that they provided financial aid to Mexican and US citizens. I'm not a US citizen, I'm a Mexican citizen. And so once I heard that, it was a no brainer for me that I was going to apply there. And so, you know, I worked really hard to prep for standardized testing. It wasn't my best. I've never been a good standardized test taker. But I think if I were to boil it down, the way that I was able to get in was through asking for help, college guidance, and also just working really hard and keeping a really good GPA and spending a lot of time on the ACT. Uh, I think that's how I would narrow it down. But it really just comes down to my brother and I getting really, really lucky.
Got it. And going into Dartmouth, I know you said you didn't have a lot of guidance like around you, a lot of kids coming from where you were, not necessarily pursuing college. What was important for you to kind of make the most out of your experience at Dartmouth? Kind of what led you to eventually going into State Street and pursuing the majors you did? Could you give us some context into what your experience there was like? And if you were to change a thing or two, what would that be?
So my experience at Dartmouth, it felt a little bit like getting a ticket to the game or getting invited to the game, but not no one explaining the rules to you. And so I was at school, but suddenly I was working with or going to school with students who knew that they wanted to go into consulting. I had no clue what consulting was, or who
Yep.
wanted to go into banking. I thought banking was where you deposited your check. I had no clue what these career options were. And so I was just there essentially just to be a student. I wasn't really thinking about the professional element of college.
Hmm.
That was because I wasn't exposed to it. And it was by me asking my friends who were doing the recruiting process, who were doing those summer internships. It was just by being with them and asking them what they were actually doing and what it meant. And being humble about it, being okay with admitting the fact that I didn't know. I think that helped me get exposure to those fields. But for me, what I realized is that I was way too late to the game. So
Hmm.
I didn't do a summer internship my sophomore year. I did a nonprofit for my junior year internship. And so when recruiting came around, I submitted 30 something applications. I got 5 interviews and one offer.
Hmm.
And that was because I didn't have that professional track record. And so my advice would be to start the moment that you get on campus, start thinking about what areas you might want to explore and start to develop professional experience in those areas, whether it's a paid or unpaid internship, so that when recruiting comes around your junior year, you're able to land that junior year internship, which will then make senior year recruiting a lot easier.
Yeah, that's a good point. I'm originally from India, and when I landed at UMass, I had no clue. And look around and you see all these kids who have seem to have it all figured out. They're talking about what they want to end up in after senior year, all the internships they're going to take, and you can feel pretty overwhelmed. But I think you made a good point. Just be humble that you don't know, and just like start to take part in clubs, figure it out. Even if you're late, you might as well be late than never. So uh, I think that's pretty good advice. What made you go into State Street and the internal consulting team? Was that kind of like, hey, these guys are giving me a job, or was it like this is something I want to do?
Yeah, I think, if you were to look at my resume, you would think that everything was pre planned. It
Hmm.
wasn't. State Street just so happened to be the one company that gave me an offer coming out
Hmm.
of Dartmouth. And I liked who I was going to be working with. I thought that while it wasn't McKinsey, Bain, or BCG, I could still do some consulting and kind of use
Hmm.
that as a platform for what comes next. And third, it led me to Boston, which I was fascinated with Boston, the idea of Boston, the idea of living there. And so those three things made me comfortable with going there. I wish I could tell you that I had a plan going into it. For me, it was more so, thank goodness I have a job
Hmm.
and they took a chance on me. And so now let me try to go make the most out of it. And here's what I would highlight one thing. I think that the person I was working for, Benjamin Langis, when I interviewed with him, he was incredibly intimidating. He had incredibly high standards. And when I thought about whether I wanted to work for him or not, the fact that he had such high standards showed me that he was going to teach me a lot.
Hmm.
And so even though it wasn't a name brand, it wasn't Goldman Sachs,
Hmm.
I felt comfortable going into it because I knew that I could use him to learn or I could use him for a recommendation letter right down the road. And so I was thinking a little bit about the MBA from the very first step. But frankly, if I'm being really honest, it just so happened that they gave me a job and I just went for it. And I said, okay, this is an ideal starting point, but it's a starting point. How do I start to plan ahead to get to where I want to be, which is go at an MBA and
Yep.
go get an MBA and then hit the reset button?
Funny enough, after graduating college, after I think 2 or 3 months of failed job applications, for H-1B reasons, for qualification reasons, whatever. State Street was the first company that actually gave me a position as well. It was a temporary role, but the same day I got an offer from Catalan, which is where we met and where you transitioned to, and I ended up taking a Catalan offer. I guess transitioning into that, what made you kind of transition into a sales role, going from banking, if you will?
Yeah. So here's where I would say like my I have two guiding principles when I make decisions: follow good people and go where it's scary.
Mm-hmm.
And so when I started applying to jobs 18 months into State Street, I applied to other consulting firms, I applied to other banks, I applied to tech firms, I applied to everything. I just wanted to go somewhere else. And when I stumbled upon Hourly Nerd or Catalan, what I saw was that one, there were really smart people there. So the
Mm-hmm.
founders went to HBS, half of the executive team was from HBS. And two, they were doing something really interesting. The third part that scared me was the fact that it was this nebulous role of client strategy slash business development. They said something about picking up the phone, cold calling,
Mm-hmm.
reaching out to people. And I was like, I don't know how to do that. I'm an introvert at the end of the day. That sounds really scary. But I know that if I'm with these folks in the room,
Mm-hmm.
I know that good things will happen. And so I did everything possible to get their attention, to get in the door. I even told them that I would have been an office manager
Hmm.
to be working at Hourly Nerd. That's how much I believed in the company, and that's how much I wanted to be with that group of people. And eventually I convinced them after 12, 14 interviews, I convinced them to take a chance on me. And I found myself in a sales role. Again, I wish I could tell you it was planned,
Mm-hmm.
but it wasn't. It just so happened to be that I was following good people and I was going where it was scary.
Got it. And I guess from there, things worked out for you. You had a very successful career at Catalan, and uh, you decided you wanted to go to business school, and you ended up at Harvard Business School. I'm curious, what kind of prompted you to go the MBA route? Is that something that you had always wanted to do? And the second one is, I guess you got into one of the best programs in the world. Like, what do you think was important in your application that helped you get in? And what advice would you give to people who are looking to, get into some of the top programs in the world?
The way that or the reason why I decided to go get an MBA was because, as I mentioned earlier, during undergrad, I didn't really know how to play the game.
Hmm.
And so I was able to squeeze into the game, and then suddenly I felt really behind a lot of my peers. And so I saw the MBA as a way for me to hit the reset button
Hmm.
and restart the game and say, okay, now that I understand some of the rules, give me the ball again and let
Yep.
me show you what I can do once I have the opportunity. And so for me, the MBA was always in the works. It was always something that I thought about even when I made my decision to go to State Street. And so leading up to that, the 6 years that I spent working before applying to business school, I had a plan that I was going to go get an MBA. And so I was able to craft a story where I could say, hey, I spent some time in consulting. Hey, I spent some time in sales. And during my time in sales, I tried to figure out who's going to write my recommendation, who's going to be able to tell a great story for me on my behalf, and how do I build those relationships. And so that answers your first question. I think the way that you get into a program like that, I wish there was a formula, but I don't think there's a formula. I think that there is a system that you can follow to maximize your chances. And that's where I'll emphasize three things. The first thing that I would emphasize would be ensuring that you have a reason why you want to go.
Hmm.
So, not just because of the brand name, you have to have a very persuasive personal reason why you want to go get an MBA and what do you want to do with that MBA. So, answering that question. The second thing that it's critically important is for you to think about who's going to write your recommendation letters and who's going to be able to tell a really good story on your behalf and work on those relationships really early on.
Hmm.
So it's not like you decide to apply and then you do it all within the span of a year. This is a 3 to 4 year process that you have to think about.
Hmm.
And then the third thing would be the GMAT. Don't delay it. Get on it as soon as you can and get it done. I took the GMAT 5 times, and it wasn't because I wanted to go from a 740 to a 770. It was
Mhm.
because I needed to break 700. I never broke 700. And so make sure that you get the GMAT out of the way as soon as possible. Because those are the three things that really matter: your why, your recommendations, your GMAT, and then the application, which is the essay and etc. But you got to have your why. Your why will feed into your essay. Your why will feed into your recommenders, and then your why is what's going to keep you motivated when you're studying at 11 p.m. for the GMAT.
And when it comes to recommendations, who gave you your recommendation? How'd you go about building that relationship with that person? And I guess what tips would you give other people who are looking to do something similar?
The structure that I would give for recommendations would be that you need someone who's gonna be able to tell a story or share perspective about you at a macro level,
Hmm.
and someone who's gonna be able to tell that same a different story at a micro level. So you want someone who can talk about your impact on the organization, and you want someone who can talk about the impact that you have on the team and on your direct performance. So when I came into Catalant, I was very thoughtful and mindful about developing a relationship with our CEO
Hmm.
so that he could write a letter about my impact on the overall organization. My direct manager, John Nyland, shout out to John Nyland, he was the one who wrote my recommendation at a micro level. So he was able to shed light into the way that I work with others,
Hmm.
the my work ethic, my attention to detail, the things that I'm good at, the things that I'm not good at. Um, and I flagged the fact that I wanted to go to an MBA 2 years before.
Hmm.
And I essentially, for every other one on one that we had, I made a point to remind him that I was going to be applying and for us to start working together on what are my strengths and what are the areas where I need feedback, and start to keep track of those stories so that when recommendation time came around, he would have those fresh in his mind. I
Hmm.
also made a recommender packet for both of them where I outlined some of those stories that we had been workshopping before and coached them on the angles that I was highlighting in my application and then the angles that I wanted them to highlight in the recommendation letters.
Got it. So clearly, it was a lot of thought put into it, and I think one interesting point you make is anyone who's if you're going to go with someone at your company, they have 100 different things they're managing. So your MBA recommendation letter is not going to be top of mind for them. So build those stories, reiterate them, and like you did, give them a template. They might be the first time they've written one of these, so show them what best practices are, and like really kind of coach them, if you will, into writing something good.
Yeah, my biggest piece of advice when it comes to recommendation letters is to ask early
Hmm.
and to ask whether they can write a great recommendation letter for you.
And what was the interview process like? Was it a matter of just sending in an application, your GMAT scores, and was there, one or two in-person interviews? Like, could you give, at a high level, could you touch on what people can expect?
Yeah, in the MBA process, sure. Um, so I think it comes down to three parts. Um, the first part is the application itself. So there's going to be a lot of short essays, a lot of short response. Some schools have you do a video. Some schools have you do like a personal statement. The most famous ones are the Stanford and the HBS ones.
Mm-hmm.
What matters most to you and why, and then what else should we know about you?
Mm-hmm.
So the application itself is a lot of work because you have to align your recommenders. You have to make sure that your it tells a compelling story. You have to make sure that your short responses echo that too. The second part is the interview process. And so for a lot of these schools, you will either interview with an alum or you will interview with someone from the admission staff.
Mm-hmm.
For HBS, it's with the admission staff. For Stanford, is an alum. And then the third part, which is the fun part, is once you get responses, figuring out where do you want to go, what feels like a good fit. And so for me, I was in an incredibly privileged position where I had to choose between Stanford, Wharton, and Harvard.
Mm-hmm.
And the way that I made that decision during COVID times was just by talking to students and also doing a gut check of what feels right. Again, follow good people and go where it's scary.
Mhm.
And when I thought about HBS, everyone that I met was so inspiring, so smart, so driven, so intimidating in a good way. And then the concept of HBS, it scared me, right?
Mhm.
It's an extrovert's playground. I'm an introvert. And I thought, hey, what better way to flex my extroverted muscle than to go there where it's really scary? So I keep coming back to these two things:
Yep.
follow good people and go where it's scary. And that's what helps with that third phase of the application process, which is the decision.
So once you're in the door, how do you make the most out of it? You know, it's 2 years of a lot of classes, a lot of projects, a lot of networking, and which people say is the most important aspect of it. Uh, I guess, yeah, the simple question is, how do you make most of it?
That's a good question, and I wish I had a perfect answer for it. But I think the best way uh, to make the most of it is to have a goal in mind as to what do you want to get out of it. So for me, my goal was I want to figure out what type of leader I am, and I want to explore different career paths. And so for me, those were the two things, those were the two overarching themes. And so the way that I explored what type of leader I was by putting myself in leadership positions.
Hmm.
So I was president of my section. I ended up being student body co-president as a way of actively practicing the leadership skills that you were being taught in the classroom.
Hmm.
The second thing around career exploration, I went in thinking that I wanted to be a consultant. So I applied, I did the whole consulting recruiting, ended up interning at BCG for the summer, realized really quickly that it was not meant for me. And so, in the spirit of exploration, I started thinking about what are some of the other areas that I wouldn't do otherwise if I didn't have an MBA.
Hmm.
And I thought about entrepreneurship. And that's when this notion of a search fund or entrepreneurship through acquisition, that's when I explored that career. And I decided that that was a career for me. And so I think the way that you make the most of it is being intentional as to what you want to get out of it from both a career perspective and from a personal perspective.
Briefly touching on the internship experience, I guess a lot of people who go into business schools want to try and land a consulting engagement. I mean, a consulting internship at one of the big three or big four firms. Could you briefly touch on what that interview process was like and what you got out of the experience, even if it wasn't for you? Like, what part of it was it that made you feel like, hey, this is not for me? And just, I think people would people would find that insightful.
The recruiting process for consulting firms is very structured. And so you do a lot of coffee chats in the fall. You submit your application towards November, December. They call you back for first and second rounds uh, during December, and then you interview in January. And by January, mid January, you know where you're going to be.
Hmm.
And so it's very structured. And I think that's what gives a lot of people comfort because instead of doing all the networking and trying to figure out whether a company's hiring or not, you kind of have this pipeline that they bring you through.
Hmm.
So I think that's really good because it is very structured. You kind of know what you have to do. Um, it requires you to do a lot of case prep. That's the main thing. If you're in an MBA program, it's likely that you're able to have a conversation. It's likely that you're able to have ask really good questions. But the case studies that you get interviewed on, that's the most important part. So practicing a lot of those. I remember I did like 40 something cases to try to impress my interviewers. I ended up not getting an offer from McKinsey or Bain, but just getting an offer from BCG. And so it's still a bit of you got to roll the dice a little bit as well. In terms of how I realized that the internship was not for me, from having experience in sales and from owning a quota and having to deliver a specific amount of money for the company, I developed this sense of ownership
Hmm.
and this drive to get to that goal. Consulting didn't have that. And at BCG, I was responsible for a few slides, and that's about it. There really was no tangible goal to get to. There was no way of quantifying my effort. And I realized that for me, that is incredibly important.
Hmm.
And that's what made me realize that since I love having the ball in my hand all the time, since I love making the decisions, since I love being the one in the spotlight, Being a consultant was just not going to give me that. And then that's when I thought about, why don't I just go and be a CEO really early on in my career? I don't have the risk tolerance to be an entrepreneur, start from scratch. But what I do have is the skill set, sales, and a little bit of consulting to take over a company and try to run something that's already been established. And that's how my search fund came to be.
I guess that's a good segue. Uh, so before we touch on the search fund, would you say what you're doing is within the PE world right now, private equity, that is?
Absolutely. I would rephrase it a little bit to say that this is micro private equity.
Mm-hmm.
And so, yes, you're still investing in a private enterprise, but you're investing at a much lower size than typical private equity. So, whereas a private equity transaction could be something between 300 million and above, we're looking at transactions that are likely going to be 100 million and below, or even 50 million and below. So it's micro. What's what we call micro cap private equity.
I guess when it comes to popular careers, if you want to call it, outside of tech, there's investment banking, there's consulting, private equity, hedge funds, if you want to count it, and venture capital, I'd say. And I feel like private equity is the one that's kind of least understood by the general population. Do you mind giving like a 30-second overview of kind of what private equity exactly means and how it's kind of different from, I guess the closest comparison would be a venture capital, I guess, because investment banking and consulting are pretty different in terms of business model.
Yeah. So private equity is an investment vehicle that allows investors to invest in private companies. The distinction between private equity and venture capital is that private equity is investing in companies that have been already established, that have a track record of performing, of generating cash flow. The goal of private equity is to come in, help professionalize or help streamline some of those operations, hold the company for 5 to 7 years, and then sell it at a profit to a bigger player or a strategic.
Got it. And when you went about starting your own fund, what made you choose to start your own fund versus going to work at a private equity firm for a few years and then going directly? And B, how'd you go about raising funds?
So I didn't have the skill set to go directly into private equity. And something that folks should know is that for you to go into private equity, 95% of the time, you need investment banking experience. So direct investment banking experience, ideally at a top tier bank.
Hmm.
I didn't have that, and I was not really interested in getting banking experience because, again, it will come back to this lack of ownership, lack of drive. And so, what I thought about was, okay, so what am I good at? I'm an operator. I'm not an investor. And the beautiful thing about this concept of entrepreneurship through acquisition is that you get to be both an investor for a brief 6 month period, and then you get to be an operator after you acquire a company. And so that kind of gave me the best of both worlds because it's giving me exposure to the investing side,
Hmm.
but it's also going to give me the ability to be a young CEO for the next 10 to 15 years. That's why I decided to go into a search fund. And also, again, coming back to the entrepreneurial drive, ownership. How do I generate wealth, not just cash flow? All these things went into my consideration to do my own.
Hmm.
And yes, I could have networked my way into a private equity firm, but without banking experience, they would have had to train me from zero.
Hmm.
I wouldn't have gotten into a name brand or a brand name private equity firm. So for all those reasons, I decided to do my own. And then in terms of raising funds, one of the great things about getting an MBA and going to a place like Harvard Business School is that this model of entrepreneurship through acquisition is a very well established career path. And so investors know that. And so the moment that I showed interest in exploring this and going down the traditionally funded route, investors would reach out to me, and then we would have a conversation where I would vet them, try to get a sense of what they bring to the table, whether we connect or not. And that's how I was able to, with very little effort, talked to 30 something investors, and then I narrowed down that pool to the six investors that I work really, really well with. And those are the folks who are helping me fund my search. And once I find a company, will help me fund the acquisition of that company.
And are these mostly angel investors who are investing in search funds, or are there bigger institutional investors as well?
They all specialize in investing in search funds. So they all have a track record of investing in this vehicle. Some of them have been doing this for 30 something years. Some of them started a fund 5 years ago, were previously searchers. It's all a bit of a range.
Got it. And I guess what's a typical day in your life like now that you've just kind of kicked off your fun?
You'll laugh at this, but my day usually looks like that of a sales rep or a
Hmm.
account executive at a tech company. It's a combination of prospecting, having calls with business owners, working on the deals that are in the pipeline, and then communicating with my investors to make sure that we are getting all of our questions answered about the deals that we're working on. So that would be the bulk of my time. I think that if I were to do like a percentage split, very similar to a sales role, I'm spending half of my time prospecting, 10% of the time with business owners talking on the phone, and then the rest is working on a deal. So whether that is arriving at a valuation, working on letters of intent, talking to debt providers, doing the due diligence of some of the companies we're looking at, talking to business brokers, all that you need to do in order to bring a deal down the pipeline. Again, very similar to a sales role.
I guess they say most CEOs come out of a sales role, right? So it kind of makes sense that what you're doing right now is in line with what you were doing back in your sales role.
I was going to say, I think if I were to give one piece of advice to someone who's starting off their career, it would be to get exposure to sales as soon
Hmm.
as they can. And the reason for that, I think it's twofold. One of them is that regardless of what you decide to do, you will always be convincing someone. And
Hmm.
so you need to be able to ask good questions to figure out what you need to do in order to convince them. And sales teaches you that. The other thing is that, as you mentioned earlier, if you look at the Fortune 500 CEOs, the majority of them have a sales background or have been a sales rep at some point. And I think that's incredibly valuable because without salespeople, nothing happens. And so salespeople have a clear understanding of the value proposition of a product, the value of a customer, the value of a dollar. And I think that mindset is just incredibly powerful when you are running an organization because your focus is on growth and how do you get more clients, how do you get more money in the door versus focusing on the financials, which the financials are incredibly important, don't get me wrong. But if you don't understand how to sell your product, what the value proposition is, how to push a deal forward, it's going to be incredibly difficult for you to be able to convince your board of directors, be able to convince your own staff, be able to convince your customers that you're the right person for the job.
I agree. I think to a certain extent, I was pretty introverted as well, and going into sales, it kind of numbs you to rejection, and it like forces you to get desensitized to a lot of things, and it gets easier and easier. Then it starts translating into your personal life, where a lot of things that would have previously stressed you out or ruined your day, you kind of just learn to brush off. And the point you made, you're always selling in whatever role you're in. That's what you realize once you're in a corporate environment. Even if you're in a non-client facing role, you're selling internally on what you need to work on, different product features, whatever. You're selling to internal stakeholders. So that's a good life skill to have in general. So I think that's a pretty good point.
Yeah. And I think that people have this notion of what sales is and what a salesperson looks like and what their personality is like. I
Just
think
someone in
that
a boiler room just cold calling away and really being
exactly,
sleazy and persuasive. Yeah, that's the image that people
yeah,
seem to have.
Wolf of Wall Street, right? Like
Yep.
that's how they picture salespeople are. And I think that what's important for people early on in their career to know is that sales is not about being the loudest in the room. It's not
Yep.
about being the one with the most personality or the one who walks in and captures everyone's attention. That's not all about sales. The important skill about sales is asking the right questions and knowing how to listen and being able to use that information that you're getting to push your agenda forward. And that applies not just when you're working in a professional setting, but it also applies in your personal life as well. And I think that is really, really important because at the end of the day, the way that you win over people is when they feel like they're being listened to.
Hmm.
And when you're able to bring back some of the little details that they shared with you. And I think because of my experience in sales, it's become a habit. It's become an instinct, as I'm sure you can relate to it as well.
Absolutely. And I guess last question in terms of compensation, I know there's no standard compensation for search funds because you kind of are setting your own pay. I'm imagining, but in general, in PE, I guess, what can people expect to make once they get into a specific role? I guess mostly out of an MBA program, and maybe further down the road in terms of a search fund, like what sort of compensation is it? And mostly, I guess the question is in terms of structure. Is it mostly tied to how the business does? Any context that you're able to share? I know you're still early, but would be helpful.
Yeah. So I think this is based on the few points of data that I have from my classmates. Coming out of an MBA as a private equity vice president, you would probably be making anywhere above 220
Hmm.
plus carry, which is the most important part about private equity. And what carry is essentially your stake of ownership in the investments that the firm is making.
Hmm.
And so I think with that, you could be looking at 400, 500, depending on how well the fund is performing and depending on how long you've been in the fund. From a search fund perspective, the expectation is that you're not going to be making a lot of money during your search phase. And that's not the point, right? The
Hmm.
point is for you to find a company. Once you find a company, you are expected to make what a CEO of a lower middle market company makes. So anywhere between 175 to 225, depending on the business.
Hmm.
The key here is that your most of your compensation is going to be tied up in the equity that you own in the business. And so a lot of searchers end up owning between 30 to 25% of the business.
Hmm.
And so if you think about it, if you buy a business that is 10 million of enterprise value and you grow it to 100 million of enterprise value and you end up owning 25% of that, that's 25 million in the span of, let's say, 7 to 10 years.
Yep.
And when you divide that compensation, it's way higher than cash compensation that you would be making at a consulting firm or a private equity firm, uh, without without a lot of the flexibility that comes with being a business owner. And so you go into search, you go into lower, you go into micro cap private equity with the hopes of finding a great business, and then the compensation, your reward for it is in the back end.
Hmm. And I guess one last important thing to call out here is, and correct me if I'm wrong, with PE, what people need to keep in mind is when you're searching for a lot of these business, it's not the sexy tech companies that are raising a lot of money, have been around, that everyone knows about. It's the companies no one's ever heard of that are providing like day-to-day services or parts for manufacturing and things like that. So you really have to be good at due diligence and searching to find these kind of nuggets that most investors are missing, right?
Yeah, just to give you some context on today, right? So today I spent some time looking into bed bug detection and extermination. I looked into industrial vent cleaning.
Hmm.
I looked into corrosion detection services, and then I'm looking into software for fasteners. Those are the four things that I'm looking at. None of those scream, tech crunch at
Yep.
all, and that's totally okay with me because that means that I have less competition. That means that I can come in as a CEO and run this business very quietly, not attract too much attention, professionalize it, and then hopefully be able to buy out my investors and hold it forever,
Hmm.
or get the attention of a much bigger strategic or a much bigger private equity firm to come and acquire it, and then that's where I get my reward.
Got it. I guess last question, and we can wrap up there. Looking back on the journey you've had so far, I know everyone who's in a pretty good position will probably say, "Hey, I don't want to change anything about it. This is what brought me here." But I'm curious, is there anything that you would have done even slightly differently looking back on your career, knowing what you know now?
Two things. One, I would ask for help.
Hmm.
I would ask for help more often, and I would ask it from people that I admire. People love to help, especially when you're a junior person. People love to help you. People love to give back. So I think I would ask for help. The second would be I would be more consistent about who I follow up with and how do I foster the relationships that I built throughout my career. One of our managers, John, would always tell us that the way salespeople make money is in their follow ups. It's
Hmm.
all about following up, and I think that I would have done differently looking back is I would have been better at following up with the people that have been rooting for me from the moment that I met them. So I think those would be the two things: asking for help, and then following up with the people that you connect with throughout your career.
Well, there we go, Irvin. This has been super insightful. Thanks so much for taking your time, and good luck with the search.
Thanks, Hadish. This is a lot of fun.
And that's a wrap. Once again, thanks so much for tuning in. I hope you found that interesting and were able to gather some insights for whatever your next step in your career is. As usual, if you'd like to speak to any of the guests featured on the podcast, send us an email at hello@consultspot.com and we'll set you up with a one on one call with anyone who's in a job or school that is of interest to you so you can kind of pick their brain directly and learn from people who are doing it. So, before I let you go, please follow us on social media. It's ConsultSpot or ConsultSpot app on all platforms. We post short clips, and it's an easier way to digest these podcasts if you're more into short form content. And also tell a friend, could use a referral. All right. Catch you on the next one. See ya.